right, looks like we've had a bit of a slowdown in folks coming in, so we'll go ahead and get started. And if others join us, that'll be great. Uh, Thanks for spending some time with us today. My name is Lindsay Hoyt. I'm Director of Admissions at Reed College. I am just here to host my colleagues over at Disability and Accessibility Resources while they give their presentation. So just to give you a little rundown of how it'll go, we've got a presentation from DAR, and then we will have some time for questions. If you've got questions, please use the chat function, and we will answer the questions that come in through the chat. Thanks so much, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jess.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here today. I'm Jess Gibson. I use she, her pronouns. I am the director here at Disability and Accessibility Services at Reed, and I've been at Reed for 11 years now. Prior to that, I was a social worker here in Portland. And as you can see by my lovely background, I feel very lucky to work here at Reed. And I'll pass it over to our assistant director and let her introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Maddie Willon. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the assistant director here at Reed. I have a background in special education, focusing on communication disorders and autism intervention. And I'm so excited to be here to welcome you all to Reed today.
Great. And I'm just going to add for folks who just recently joined, if you have questions, please type them into the chat. I will also say that for reasons of protecting student privacy, we would ask that you please ask questions that are general questions about our process. But if you have questions that are specific to your student situation, then we invite you to schedule a one-on-one meeting with us afterwards. They're very easy to book through our webpage. We're available all summer long for virtual meetings, and that can be an opportunity to speak more about questions that might be specific to your student situation. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen now. Let's get into some of these exciting slides that we have. All right, so are folks able to see? Yeah, folks are seeing the Reed College logo. Great. All right. So this is what we're going to cover today. What is DAR? What is our office? What do we do? What kinds of accommodations do we offer at Reed, or generally at the higher ed level? How do students get started with our process? What kind of disability or medical documentation is needed? How are faculty involved in the process? And are there any other resources outside of our office that might be useful or relevant to your students? I should also say, I imagine there may be some students present today here as well. So of course, welcome to you as well. So this is geared towards students and then family members or people who support students here at Reed. All right, there are automated captions available at the bottom of your screen. You should see a little icon that says either hide captions or show captions. So for anyone who wants that, you can enable or disable at your preference. And here we are. Okay, so who we are. We are an office of 3. Myself, Maddie, and we have an accommodations coordinator named Josanne, who does all of the very important behind the scenes work to make sure accommodations actually get in place. I've been here for, like I said, over 11 years. Josanne's been here for about 5. Maddie is new to us here at Reed, but comes to us as a highly qualified professional in the field. What are we here for? So we are here at the most fundamental level to ensure access. We see ourselves here as advocates for access to make sure that students with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate and engage in the programs that Reed has to offer. And inclusion is a huge part of that, right? So we're always trying to find ways that students can be as included as possible and can participate as fully as possible, whether it's academics or housing or PE or what have you. We have a good number of students with disabilities on campus at Reed. So As of this past spring, about 1/3 of the Reed student population was formally registered as having a disability, so formally registered with our office. Of course, we know there are more students who have other disabilities and medical conditions who may not need accommodations at the moment. So yeah, that looks like about 520 students registered with our office at any given time. And I share that just for you to know, students and family members of students, your student is not alone. They will be in good company here. And we have a lot of experience working with students who have a variety of needs. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Maddie now to talk a little bit more about what our accommodation process looks like.
All right, so one of the first steps in our accommodations process is first establishing the presence of a disability. And so what qualifies as a disability in this context? This would be any medical or mental health condition that impacts the major life activities of a student and results in some kind of access barriers for that student. So not all students with disabilities need accommodations necessarily, but some do, and that is of course why our office is here. Some of the more common disabilities or conditions that we work with here at DAR are neurodevelopmental disabilities such as autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, psychological conditions like anxiety, depression, chronic medical conditions as well. And we also have some students with some sensory impairments and mobility conditions too. And then what kind of accommodations are there? So as you can see at the center of our graphic here, we take on a highly individualized approach. And so the types of accommodations offered are going to very much so be determined by the individual student and their experience with their disability. So two students with the same disability may come out of our process using different accommodations. So for that reason, we don't have a set list or menu of accommodations that align with particular diagnoses because we depend on our interactive process in order to help identify the areas in which accommodations are needed. But some of the common areas that we do offer accommodations in are academic, such as reduced distraction test environments, housing accommodations. We get very many requests for single rooms and other accommodations to help support student access needs in our housing and residence halls. We also offer PE accommodations and are here to explore accommodations in other areas that students may need as well.
All right, let's see. Oh, whoops. And there we go.
And so another part of our accommodations process takes place when we meet with a student and we have a conversation with them about, the impact of their disability and the symptoms they experience and the resulting functional impacts that has on their day-to-day activities, as well as how that interacts with the educational environment. And so that is the assessment that we use in order to help determine what accommodations a student may qualify for. We hear about the student's experience, their functioning, their symptoms, and explore the environmental factors that Reed may have created that create an access barrier. And once we identify what access barrier has been created as a result of those two things interacting, we can determine what accommodations may remove those barriers. So an example of that may be a condition like a reading disability that impacts a student's processing speed, paired with the environmental factor of a timed exam. That effectively creates a barrier for a student to not have equal opportunity to show their content knowledge in the same way as maybe some of their non-disabled peers. And so an accommodation we can put in place to remove that access barrier would be something such as extended time on exams.
And just as a separate example, another possible accommodation might be use of text-to-speech technology during an exam. And I share that as a way to echo what Maddie said earlier, that two students with the same disability might actually come out of the process with different accommodations depending on which one might be the best fit for their needs. Okay. And then, yeah.
So accommodations at the college level versus K through 12. So some students may see that oftentimes if they've had IEP or 504 plans in the past, that there may be some similarities to the accommodations they used in high school and at the college level, and there may be some differing factors as well, and there's some reasons for that. So first being that at the K through 12 level, the school is responsible for identifying a student with a disability who may be in need of academic supports. And at the college level, it is the student's responsibility to self-identify as an individual with a disability who may be in need of accommodation. And so it is their responsibility to initiate that requesting process and to get connected with our office. That being said, if you as a student or a parent of a student is on a 504 or an IEP plan, we highly encourage you to review those plans prior to meeting with us in order to familiarize yourself with the goals or the accommodations that may have been provided to you. And we can speak more about that at your intake. And another difference between accommodations at the K through 12 versus higher ed level is the assessment and documentation piece of things too. So at the K through 12 level, the school may provide assessment or documentation to establish the presence of a disability. And at the college level, the student is responsible for having that assessment and providing documentation to us upon requesting accommodations. In some cases, a student may come to us with a copy of an IEP or a 504 plan. And while that is helpful in getting the process started, we often find that the information on those documents alone may not be sufficient for our needs, but no worries, we'll be covering our other documentation requirements shortly in this presentation. Moving on, another key difference between accommodations at the college level versus the K through 12 level is our main focus at the college level is equitable access, whereas accommodations under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that were provided at the K through 12 level may have had more of a focus on academic success or guaranteeing a level of comfort for a student, such as modifying course requirements or graduation requirements. And at the college level, under the Americans with Disabilities Act in Section 504, our focus, like I said, is on that equitable access piece, meaning our accommodations don't guarantee a level of success in college, but they make sure that the student has equal chance to participate as fully as their non-disabled peers. So in college, we can't necessarily modify course or graduation requirements as an accommodation. And so students need to meet the same learning outcomes as their non-disabled peers. An example of an IEP support versus a college accommodation support may be scaffolding goals, such as a goal where a reduced amount of reading requirements is initially implemented, building up to meeting fuller requirements later on throughout the school year. At the college level, we can provide an accommodation to help the student meet the requirement, but we can't issue accommodations that would change that course requirement.
All right, thank you, Maddie. So now that we've established that there is a disability present, that perhaps some accommodations are needed, how do students actually get started with our process and connect with our office? We have, I think of it basically as three main steps. So the first one is submitting an accommodation request form. On our webpage, there is a tab specifically for incoming students. And so if you click on that tab, you'll find links to the accommodation request form. So we have two different accommodation request forms, one for housing, one for academics. Some students will be requesting accommodations in one area, some will be requesting in both. Along with that form, we require some type of documentation prepared by a third-party provider. So typically, someone's physician, their mental health provider, basically a health professional who's qualified to speak to the student's condition. And I'll get more into the documentation requirements in a bit. And then meeting with us for an intake meeting as well. So those are the three basic steps, and let's talk a little bit more about each one. So accommodation request forms. Here you can see a screenshot of our webpage, what it kind of looks like for incoming students. You also see there where the big blue arrow is, that there are some bright red and teal colored buttons on our webpage that should allow you to pretty easily find these accommodation request forms. They're not very long, but they do ask the student to reflect a little bit about their condition, how it impacts them, why the accommodation is necessary. And we find that these are useful, one, to help us in starting to understand your student's needs, but also they're helpful for your student to be able to start reflecting and perhaps articulating for themselves, how their condition impacts them and why an accommodation might be necessary. For some students, we find that they feel very comfortable advocating for themselves. For other students, we find that this might be the first time that they're having to, express things, this thoroughly, or share their story with somebody directly without the presence, of, a therapist or a parent present to help. So we find that the forms are good prep for that. Due dates. So for housing accommodation requests, that due date is coming up very soon. It's June 1st. For academic accommodations, our recommended deadline is July 15th. Now, that is a recommended deadline. Technically, students can connect with us at any time to request an academic accommodation. So let's say that your student isn't really sure if they're going to need or want to use academic accommodations when they arrive to Reed. Maybe they want to give it a go and see just kind of how things go. Totally fine, Then let's say midterms come around and the student decides, you know what, maybe some accommodations would have been necessary here. And they connect with us at that point. At the point at which they become eligible for accommodations, they can use them from that point forward. They will not apply retroactively. But there is no firm deadline for requesting academic accommodations. The reason why we recommend July 15th, though, is that is the date by which I would say it's probably the latest date if a student wants to make sure that their accommodations will all be in place by the start of the fall semester. So after that, again, welcome to connect with us whenever, but there may be a slight delay in the implementation of the accommodations the closer we get to the start of the school year. Okay, and then disability documentation. So we do on our webpage, let me see, is this gonna work? Hey, look at that. Are folks seeing our disability documentation webpage now? Great. Okay, so we have a webpage here that outlines the things that I'm going to go over on the slide. This is a very long-winded way of saying, here's the things that we need. What we've heard from some providers is, navigating this and then trying to, provide all the information in a letter feels a little daunting. So we created a form. So if you click on this, it takes you to a PDF that a student's healthcare or mental health care provider can fill out. It asks for the same information. It's just in a form format. We've heard from providers that if they say, just give me a form to fill out, it's easier for them to track and easier for us to get the information that we need. But in the end, it doesn't matter to us if we receive this form filled out or if we would just receive a letter from the provider. Either one works for us. essentially what we're looking for, right, is for the letter to be, and are you seeing my slides again now? Okay, great, thanks. The letter to be from a qualified provider, meaning, if it's a mental health condition, we would want to see documentation from someone who's qualified to diagnose and treat mental health conditions. If there is a diagnosis present, that is very helpful for us to have. Occasionally, we do see that there may not yet be a conclusive diagnosis. Perhaps the student's still working through some chronic medical stuff and still trying to figure out what's going on. That's okay too. In that case, we would ask for the rest of the information, such as symptoms. How is this impacting the student? What kinds of symptoms are they experiencing? How frequently? How severe are the symptoms? How long do they last? Functional impact. How does this impact the student on a daily basis? How does it impact them in the academic realm? For academics, we might be looking at, how does this impact their ability to read, to write, to show their knowledge in a timed environment, to focus and concentrate. In the housing realm, we might be looking at, how does this impact, their ability to access our meal plan or sleep, things like that. So the functional impact, especially as it relates to the area in which the student is going to be requesting accommodations. Essentially, the documentation is trying to help us connect the dots, right? Find that logical connection between the disability, how it impacts the student, and the requested accommodation. And how recent, I'm going to go to 504 plans next, but how recent does the documentation need to be? We don't have any hard and fast rules per se, but I will say recent enough that it can reflect the student's current level of functioning and how the impact or the condition currently impacts them. So for a condition like depression or anxiety, which can be a little more variable in nature, we would probably like to see some more recent documentation, ideally within the past year or so. For a condition that tends to be, more static or, the presence of which is likely to be there for one's lifetime, such as ADHD, the documentation doesn't have to be quite as recent. Like I said, there's no firm, deadline to say like it has to be recent within this, because we look at the totality of information that we receive. So this is where the 504 and IEP plans come into play. Those are really helpful for us to have. Usually they give us a lot of good information about, accommodations, but also other supports that could be helpful for your student. Often these alone are not sufficient. However, typically if there is a plan in place, that means that there was some kind of an assessment that led to the student having a plan. So typically there was a provider who, did a psychological evaluation or similar to arrive at a diagnosis or a disability. That original assessment or report is what we would also ask for in addition to the 504 or IEP plan. So, maybe we see that the original psychological assessment was from when the student was in 6th grade, and it was a reading disability, the presence of which has continued to be there. We have some updated information about how accommodations have gone at the high school level. That might be enough for accommodations depending on what the student is requesting. If it's, like I said, a mental health condition or something that's a little more variable in nature, we might ask for the 504A or IEP plan, plus a letter or a form, within the last year from the student's therapist or mental health provider. Okay, intake meetings. So once we have received a student's accommodation request form, we've received their documentation, then we also like to meet with them in person, because we find that getting information directly from the student is often the most helpful piece in determining what accommodations are going to be appropriate for a student. We do require intake meetings for students requesting academic accommodations. We do not require them at the outset for students requesting housing accommodations. So for housing, students would submit their form, their documentation. If needed, we will invite them to meet with us. Often we find that it's not necessary. For academics, though, there's enough to review that we do require students to meet with us before we can officially get their accommodations in place. So what happens at an intake meeting? This may take place over the summer. We do offer virtual meetings, or it may take place, once the student arrives on campus. For a student who has accommodations that take some time to coordinate, so if a student anticipates that they may need to use texts in an alternative format or captioning or interpreting services, for those, we would actually ask the student to connect with us and meet with us as soon as possible, ideally sometime in June or July. For other students, we recommend the academic intake meeting to be completed by August 1st if you want things to be in place by the start of the fall semester. Otherwise, whenever you connect with us. So what we'll do is we'll discuss the student's condition. What are the conditions for which they're requesting accommodations? How has this looked for them in the past? How does it look for them now? Which accommodations are they wanting to request? Students should be prepared to discuss their disability. We talked about that a bit. Sometimes during the meeting, we are able to arrive at an assessment of, is there an intake barrier? Is there an accommodation that could remove that barrier? Yes, we kind of arrive at an accommodation plan during that meeting. However, I would say equally as common is that we may just gather information from the student during that meeting. And then us as DAR staff, we might take some time to review what the student has shared, review the documentation. We might consult with each other as a team. We might consult with faculty just to arrive at a more informed decision. And then we will notify the student of their eligibility. So again, sometimes that happens right during the meeting. Sometimes, it might happen maybe a week or so later via email. And that's kind of how we arrive at the accommodation plan for their time here at Reed. All right, and then once we have established the types of accommodations that a student is generally eligible for, then we have to find a way to get these in place for their fall or their spring courses. And I'll let Maddie talk a little bit about how that process happens.
All right, so once we meet with the student, reviewed their documentation, completed our process, we then have a list of accommodations they're approved to request in their classes. And the way that they go about requesting those accommodations is we have an online student portal, and students receive a detailed email with instructions on how to navigate this portal and complete the request process. But basically they log on and they'll see a list of their approved accommodations, and they'll also be able to customize their requests for each of their classes. So I like to think of it as kind of an a la carte selection process, where if a student knows that there's a very reading heavy class, they may need to request relevant accommodations in that class, whereas a class in which there isn't many readings, that might not be as relevant. Or a better example may be a class in which there are timed exams and a class in which all exams are take home. And so certain testing accommodations may be relevant in some classes, but not others. So they can customize their accommodation choices during that time. And so they'll select the courses in which they want to use their accommodations. And then once they have done so, faculty are notified via email of the students' accommodations that they're approved to use in that course. And this letter is, like I said, sent out via email, but it doesn't have any personal health information such as a diagnosis or the reasoning behind a student's need for a particular accommodation. We communicate information with faculty on an as a need to know basis. And what they need to know are what your accommodations are. And so we inform them of those accommodations. That email also typically includes some bullet points about each accommodation's logistics. And then from there, depending on the accommodations, there may be some communication between the student and the faculty member required in order to establish, the logistical expectations or use of the particular accommodation in that class, such as for testing accommodations and things like that. And so it is the student's responsibility to contact their faculty member and coordinate any logistical elements of those accommodations. And so they are also CC'd on that notification letter when faculty receive it. So they'll know when faculty have been notified and when they can start establishing those lines of communication with them about what their accommodations may look like in their particular courses. That being said, while the student, does initiate that communication, DAR is always here to support students. So if a faculty member has questions about how a particular accommodation may work in their course, or they're running into some issues with implementation, please let DAR know, and we are here to help support you with that. Get in contact with the faculty member and help point them or the student any resources that may be useful in troubleshooting questions that come up along the way.
Mm-hmm. And to expand a little bit on the faculty student collaboration piece. So as Maddie was saying, sometimes it might be as simple as discussing the logistics for an upcoming exam. So at what time is the student going to start and end the exam if they're using extended time? Where will they pick it up and drop it off? So it's not a conversation about why or whether the student needs accommodations. It's really just focused on, how is this going to work? We also find that, for some students, this process feels comfortable. For other students, it takes a little more getting used to, but it is a really great opportunity to establish, to first, start the relationship with faculty, have a first point of contact. So we have heard from many students that it can be a nice way to initiate a relationship with their faculty, that hopefully they're going to continue to stay in communication around many other things for the rest of the semester. And yes, DAR is available as needed to provide support if any issues come up. Okay, so outside of accommodations, sometimes we meet with students and we might find that there is indeed some aspect of their disability that's impacting them, but the solution may not always be an accommodation. So we do have other resources available at Reed to support students. An example might be, a student who says, gosh, I really struggle with time management, with perfectionism. I tend to delay starting my tasks until close to the due date. Or a student who says, I just have a hard time with tracking, and now that I have courses and they're all posting due dates in different places, and I'm having a hard time with my tracking and organization. There may not be an accommodation solution for those things, but perhaps a referral to our academic coaching services could be very useful. So we at DAR, we provide those referral services and we help connect students to other resources as well. So one of the first things that I mentioned here is academic support. Their office is located in the same building as our office. They provide one-on-one coaching with students around things like academic skills, but also executive functioning, things like time management and organization. The coaching tends to be, I would say, brief, sort of solution focused, or brief, outcome focused coaching. So that might look like, maybe a student meets with us or meets with coaching for the first time as their midterms are approaching, and they realize, gosh, I have a lot of stuff to do at the same time. I don't know how I'm going to manage my time or how I'm going to plan for that. They can meet with a coach for a few weeks to start putting a plan in place, develop a study plan, help figuring out, what do I need to prioritize now? What can wait till later? And then maybe the student gets through that period, goes on and practices those skills. And maybe we don't see the student again until they run into, some difficulties with a writing assignment. Then they might reconnect with their coach. So it tends to be intermittent, maybe for a few weeks here or there. For many of our students, I find that level of coaching is sufficient. We do still have some students who choose to work with private executive functioning coaches that they hire, in the Portland area or elsewhere. Academic support also offers tutoring and workshops. So workshops on topics like, skills for, test taking when you're taking math tests, or time management. And then we have a really good peer tutoring program here at Reed. It's a robust program. It is very widely used by our students. So these are other students who have been hired, who've already successfully completed the course, who are providing tutoring to students at Reed. We provide both group, which is drop-in tutoring. You can stop by whenever you want. And we also provide one-on-one tutoring. So students can log on to the academic support website and book an individual tutoring session with a one-on-one tutor. And students can receive, I believe it's 1 hour of tutoring per class per week. So that's for the individual tutoring. The drop-in group tutoring is unlimited. So that is a really valuable resource here at Reed. For things that are maybe outside of academics, maybe a student's going through some time of personal challenge or difficulty. Maybe they're having a hard time navigating a system here at Reed or finding their way to the right place. Maybe they've had a difficult, relationship issue recently and they're just kind of generally struggling or needing some support. We have our Dean of Students office and our care team. So these are folks who can take kind of a holistic view at what might be happening for a student and trying to figure out who would be best suited to provide support. So if you're just like, I'm worried about my student, they're going through these things or this behavior has changed in them lately, and I just would like to know that someone can check in with them or someone can provide some resources. There is a website for our care team where anyone can submit what's called a care team referral. So a student could submit one for themselves. They could submit one for a peer, a parent or family member could submit one, or a faculty member could submit one for a student. And it's basically just a way to say, hey, care team, could you put eyes on this student and just see if they need any help? And then our care team coordinator, which is our director of student support, will then decide what's the most appropriate way to provide support or outreach to that student. We also have a health and counseling center here on our office. So just to clarify, care team is offering support, in different offices on campus. Often we'll refer to health and counseling center. Care team does not provide professional medical or counseling services, but our health and counseling center does. So they provide, a pretty wide range of services. And then for any areas that fall outside of their area of expertise or the realm in which they can practice, they also provide referrals and helps connect students with local area providers. They also have a case manager who can help students find a local provider who's within the student's insurance network. And if there are any other things that the student is looking for, maybe they would really like to work with a therapist who's LGBTQ friendly, or someone who's a first generation, someone who identifies as having been a first generation student, they can help the student find a provider who might be a good fit for them in that way. And then of course, there's lots of other things, right? Fun ways for students to get involved. We have an Office for Institutional Diversity that has a great peer mentor program. Our Office for Student Engagement offers lots of opportunities for students to socialize and connect with each other in a non-academic way, both on and off campus. We have a great athletics and outdoor recreation program that also offers opportunities on and off campus. Our sports center is currently being renovated, so that should be all fancy and brand new by the time students arrive, and that will be exciting. All right, and I think, we got through things pretty quickly. So that is the bulk of what we have for today. I'm going to go now to the chat and see what questions are in there, see what exciting things we can answer for you. And again, as a reminder, you can email us or you can schedule a phone or video appointment if you want to discuss something that's perhaps a little more particular to your student situation. I'm going to stop screen sharing now. Okay. Great. So how can students get help with executive functioning? I think we just covered that. So I would say, and this question does go to a bit more detail. I would say our coaching does tend to be a little more focused on, things that are more relevant to academic skills and academic functioning. So it might look like studying, planning, time management, tracking your assignments, prioritizing tasks. When it comes to more like personal care, how am I going to be balancing that, with also doing my laundry and, checking my student balance and, grocery shopping if needed. I would say sometimes those come into play, but by and large, I would say the focus that we offer tends to be a little more focused on academic functioning. So if a student is wanting help with like sort of more broadly speaking executive functioning and daily functioning, that might be a good opportunity to find kind of a private coach or private therapist to work with. We also find that for some students, they might be working with someone over the summer in preparation for their transition to Reed, trying to figure out how to navigate some of those life skills. And for some students, it is an adjustment, and they arrive at Reed and they realize that maybe they need to make some tweaks or some adjustments. And I would say that's also a process that all first year students are going through as they arrive here at Reed, whether they have a disability or not. Are Zoom meetings okay for intake? Yeah, so we allow students to choose. I would say in person is nice if the student is on campus. We just find it's easier to establish a connection or rapport. So students tend to prefer in-person meetings when they're on campus. However, if you do not live in the Portland area and if you're wanting to meet with us over the summer, or if the student is, then yeah, Zoom, virtual, totally fine. Can the Health and Counseling Center help find a therapist in advance? I don't know the answer to that. I would recommend contacting them to find out. Many of their staff members are 10-month staff members who don't work during the summer because most of our students are not here during the summer. So I'd say the bulk of their services and kind of when they're at fullest capacity is between August and May. But you're certainly welcome to contact them just to see what kind of services they provide over the summer. Getting a list of referrals. So I probably would recommend, so Counseling Center probably are the right folks to contact about that. I would maybe just follow up with them. There is an actual spreadsheet that they have that they can share. I think students have to have their Reed computer account set up because it does require students to log in to access the spreadsheet. But when they do, there is a nice spreadsheet for mental health providers that is searchable by condition, by insurance, things like that. So that should be something that the Counseling Center should be able to provide. Is the intake meeting required for students seeking accommodations? So intake meeting required, yes, if you're seeking academic accommodations. Not required at the start if seeking housing accommodations, but we may invite the student to meet with us if we need to. All right, can DAR help students initiate faculty contact at the beginning of the term? Self-advocacy skills still need scaffolding. So essentially the way that we help students connect with faculty, I would say, is twofold. One, during that intake meeting, oftentimes we can talk to students about that. Do you have any questions about, talking to your faculty? How comfortable do you feel having these conversations? And we can even do a little mini coaching session, right? Let's talk about what it's going to feel like when you talk to your faculty member. What are some topics or questions that you would want to bring to them? Help the students start to feel a little more prepared for that conversation. Also, the emails that we send out, those accommodation letters that get sent to both student and faculty, those provide some guidance. So those say, student and faculty member, the two of you will need to meet and connect. And here are some specific talking points that you'll want to address. So we find that often when students come in with sort of this letter, this agenda saying, hey, can we connect about these things? It feels a little less scary than just going in sort of with a blank slate. I would also say oftentimes faculty will initiate that contact. So oftentimes the faculty member might reach out and say, hey, Sara, I got your accommodation letter. Let's meet, let's connect. Or it can be as simple as the student emailing the professor and saying, hey, could we meet? So pretty low stakes initial contact. And then the next meeting tends to happen in person. It can also be reassuring for students, again, to know that we have over 500 students with disabilities at Reed using accommodations. Faculty are well versed in having these conversations and knowing how to support students in initiating that process. So generally speaking, we find that once those emails get sent, students and faculty do manage to connect with one another. With all that said, if a student is still thinking like, I'm just not sure about this, of course, they can connect with us. Maybe we could help send an initial, introductory email to the student and the faculty member, or we could coach the student through, ways to feel more comfortable or ways to approach the conversation with their faculty. If the student submits all of their documentation, will they receive an email to schedule the intake meeting? Yes, they will receive a few emails. So once a student submits an accommodation request form, if there is documentation attached or uploaded right there along with their form, then they'll get an email from us saying, hey, we got your form, we got your documentation. Your next step is to schedule a meeting. Here's the link. If they send us an accommodation request form, but there's no documentation provided, they'll get an email saying, hey, we got your form. Your next step is to submit documentation to us. Here's a link to our documentation guidelines. And then if we, don't hear from the student for a while, we typically also send reminder emails saying, hey, we got your form, we got your documentation. We never did hear from you for an intake meeting. Would you still like to meet with us? Here's how you can book with us. So we do tend to send a couple reminders before we might decide that we are no longer perhaps being helpful and we may stop sending reminders, but they usually will receive at least a few from us. What else? I'd say the last thing to know is, the accommodation plan that we come up with students during, their that initial intake process. That is not unchangeable. Maybe a student finds later on that their condition has evolved in a way that they didn't anticipate. Maybe there's a newly developed condition and they find that they may need to tweak their accommodations or request different accommodations. They can always reconnect with us later on to say, hey, can we revisit my accommodation plan? And we can take a look to see whether any adjustments might be necessary. Okay, I'm just gonna maybe give it another minute or so to see if we have any other last minute questions coming in. Again, you're always welcome to email us. I'm just gonna type it here into the chat. dir@reed.edu. And then you're also welcome to schedule just a general information meeting with us if you just have more questions about the process and how it works. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in, but thank you all for coming today. I hope this was helpful. And we really look forward to meeting your students and working with your students and supporting them here during their time at Reed.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Maddie. That was great. Thank you to all the students and families who are here with us today. I hope this was helpful and informative, and we look forward to working with you throughout the summer and when your students get here. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.